Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to INSS podcast. My name is Adi Kanto. In recent months, while attention is focused on Iran's proxies in the Middle East, and we saw that with great intensity also yesterday with Israel's aerial attack in Yemen against the Houthis, it seems that Tehran is expanding its activities also in Africa, increasing the threat to Israeli interests on the continent. In a new INSS Insight titled Iran in the Continent of Africa, researcher Denis Tsintrinovich elaborates on the threats to Israel's fundamental political, security, and economic interests in this region. Israel, according to Tsintrinovich, needs to formulate a strategy to prevent Iran from achieving its goals in Africa. So with me in the Zoom today is Denis Tsintrinovich, research fellow in the Iran program at the Institute for National Security Studies. Denis served for 25 years in a variety of command position units in Israel, Israeli Defense Intelligence, and including as the head of the Iran branch in the Research and Analysis Division in the Israeli Defense Intelligence and the division's representative in the United States. Denis, thank you so much for joining me in this talk today. Very relevant also for what occurred yesterday in Yemen. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Adi. Just to start a little bit about what happened yesterday and the connection to Africa, and I
Please.
think that's extremely important. I think that in the end of the day, when Israel focused in the past on the Iranian threat, it was mainly on its activity in the Middle East and, of course, its nuclear activity. But today, as we see what happened yesterday, it's obvious that we need to look at the larger picture. And the larger picture is that Iran is working through its proxies to expand its influence, not only in the Middle East. For example, the Houthis, the famous Houthis, actually are working in the last month in Africa, near what we call the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, from the African side in Somalia, to increase the threat on Israel maritime activity near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, but not only against Israel. So in that regard, when we talk about Africa, it's not something that it's far-fetched, that it's nice to have in also many ways. It's really the need, it's connected to the need of Israel and international community to look at the broader picture when discussing the Iranian threat, and the Houthis and what's happening today with their activity in Africa is an important example for it.
No doubt about it. And just for our audience, to update who's listening to us, we're talking about when we're talking about the Houthis, we're talking about 9 months of war. This didn't start in 48 hours from now. We're talking about 9 months that this organization fires towards Israel, and something changed on Friday morning in Israel 2 days ago. One of the drones that was sent to an Israeli target in Tel Aviv was successful. And after that, the attack came yesterday, the response, the Israeli response. The Israeli Air Force struck in Yemen. What is your assessment, Denis, regarding what happened in the last 48 hours? Because something indeed changed. We're talking about a long course war, 9 months that the Houthis are firing. But how do you assess the last 48 hours, and what can Israel expect from now? And after this, we will attend, of course, to Africa.
Yeah, of course, as I mentioned, of course, everything is aligned and intertwined, so everything is connected. So just for our audience, that's a little bit about the Houthis in general. Houthis are a terror Yemeni group that actually took over most of Yemen, not all of Yemen, around 70%, and actually conducted the fierce war against the Saudis years ago. And Houthis used this war in order to attack strategic facilities in Saudi Arabia. Now, this group that was a threat to the region years ago become a threat to the actually international community, and in also many ways because of the Iranian help to this group. Now, the Iranian and the Houthis are Shiites, both of them. A little bit difference between regarding the Shiite itself, but the Iranian understand the need to support the Houthis. They earn a couple of things from supporting them. First, they can use them in order to counter their biggest rivalry in the region, Saudi Arabia. But also they can now, as we can see, since the war, since the start of the war, what we call the war with Hamas in Gaza, we see that the Iranians are using the Houthis in order to attack Israel and are actually trying to force Israel to stop the war against Hamas and thus saving Hamas.
With
So
this
that
clear
helped.
interest of creating a ring of fire, yeah, around Israel.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It's a part of the ring of fire against Israel. And in order to do so, the Iranians actually send strategic capability to the Houthis, not only UAVs, but surface to surface missiles. But not only that, because it's very hard to transfer this kind of capabilities because of the logistical problem that it's, or when you're looking at actually the map between to transfer arms between Iran and Yemen, it's a logistical, let's say, challenge in not so many ways, whether you will transfer that through sea or through Oman. That is why they actually moved to what we call the production of indigenous capabilities, meaning that the Houthis are producing themselves these kind of capabilities, or most of these capabilities, and thus allowing
right.
them
It was
actually
an improved Iranian UAV.
exactly with the help of Quds for officers that actually are based in Yemen itself. So actually, what we have today, we have a terror group that has strategic capabilities that can actually threat not only Israel or not only Israeli cities, but also Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That actually is an important geographical place in terms of allowing the maritime movement to go between Asia and Africa, and from there to Europe. And that is why what they're doing is not only causing problems to Israel, but also, for example, causing problems to Egypt. We know that the income from the Suez Canal is a vital element in the overall Egyptian income. And the fact that there are no ships moving back and forth, or the number is really decreasing, it's really hurting the Egyptian economy. So in that regard, what the Houthis are doing today with the backing of Iran is not only causing problems to Israel, but causing problems to the region and the international community as a whole. And that is why there is a need in order not only to counter the Houthis, but making sure that Iran will be accountable for the Houthis' activity, and also working hard in disconnecting the connection between Iran and the Houthis. And that is why there is a need to work in a coalition, because as I said, the bottom line is that it's not only an Israeli event, it's a Saudi event, it's a UAE event, it's a Gulf in general, but also, like I mentioned, the US is working with the Houthis because what they're doing today is actually have a strong implication on the region, but also on the international community as a whole.
Clear. But Israel decided in the last 9 months not to respond and let the coalition, so to say, respond in its, I don't know if in its name, but in an alliance until yesterday.
Yes.
How do you think this will affect also the relations between Israel and its partners from now on?
Well,
how do they view it? What Israel did yesterday?
Well, that is an important question. I think that, of course, Israel had to retaliate. You know, the Houthis attacking Israel from the 8th of October, more or less.
Yeah.
But the fact that they managed to launch a UAV that actually hit Tel Aviv and killed an Israeli citizen, this is something that Israel could not accept. And of course, it's not only connected to the Houthis, but also to the region as a whole. Everybody's looking at what Israel is doing. And it's important for the Israeli deterrence at the end of the day, to react. And this is what we did yesterday. And I think it was an important step in that regard. But it's also important to say that it won't stop the Houthis from continuing launching those capabilities. And what happened this morning in Eilat actually highlight that. It won't solve the problem. It's important for Israeli deterrence, but it's not will solve the problems because at the end of the day, there is a strong connection between the proxies and what's happening in Gaza. And unless Israel will reach some sort of a ceasefire with Hamas, probably we'll find ourselves in more and more escalation, not only regarding the Houthis, but regarding Shiite militias in Iraq and Hezbollah and so forth. Now, in terms for your important question, I think that it's important to say that it is vital to work within a coalition against this kind of a threat. For example, on Friday night, when the UAV struck Tel Aviv, actually 4 other UAVs were intercepted by the American side. Mm-hmm. So actually, it's highlight the need to work together. And also, I think the Saudis has an important role in that regard. The Saudis and the Houthis preserve some sort of ceasefire agreement that actually help the Saudis in multiple arenas, domestically also, but in terms of its foreign policy, allowing them to enhance the cooperation with Iran. But I think at the end of the day, the Houthis are a threat to us and to the Saudis. And I think that it's important to coordinate our activities, not only in terms of defensive wise, but also offensive wise. I think that's extremely important because at the end of the day, only by this kind of cooperation and coordination, we'll be able to build some sort of strategy that will counter this threat. Look, the Houthis will not disappear. Even if tomorrow there'll be a ceasefire in Gaza, they will do other things because I think in the end of the day, they understood that the use of force can really improve their status within the axis of resistance. That's why I think that this is a long-term project that we'll have to work within a coalition in order to find a way to limit or to undermine their capabilities.
Definitely. Then it's very interesting. Long-term project, of course, because the problem remains Iran. And let's now move back to your article that you wrote, the Inside, INSS Inside, that was published last week on Iran in Africa. So what are the fundamental interests of Iran in Africa? We know that Iran is all over. Why Africa? Why strategically this region threatens so much Israel?
Again, an important question. I think that when I wrote the article, the main thing was to highlight that, and of course, I will relate to your important question. But first, I want to say something that also I mentioned at the beginning of our podcast. At the end of the day, we cannot focus on the Iranian threat only by understanding what they're doing on the nuclear side or in the Middle East. Because when the Iranians look at the world, they look at the entire world. For the supreme leader of Iran, he cares from the Shiite diaspora in Latin America, in Australia. They care about supporting their followers in Nigeria, and they care about supporting Hezbollah in smuggling drugs from Latin America. So in that regard, we have to look at it holistically. We have to understand that if we want to put pressure on the Iranian regime, we have to relate also to that. That's in general terms important to say when discussing the Israeli strategy in countering Iran activities, malign activities. Africa is an important continent to Iran because of several reasons. First and foremost, you have a lot of what we call the Shia diaspora, living especially in the west side of Africa. And for Iran, that needs to protect what it perceived to be its main objective, to protect the Shia diaspora all over the world. Of course, they care about controlling them, protecting them, making sure that they can make the best use of them for multiple venues and reasons. That is one. Second, of course, it's some sort of ideological alignment. The Iranians are countering the colonials, the Western way of thinking in also many ways. And I think that they see that the African countries are thinking alike in terms of same history of countering the West, struggling for independence. So for them also is extremely important. Third is also a venue for what we call ideological struggle between them and the Sunni. We know that the Sunni countries like Saudi, like the UAE, also working in Africa. And for Iran, it's important that they will counter this kind of activity, making sure that the Shiites won't convert to Sunnism and things like that. So that's another venue. But
another
also
battlefield between the Sunni and the Shia.
Exactly. Exactly. And of course, the last but not least is the issue of the economical aspect. The Iranians believe that they can exploit what we have in Africa, like precious metals and other elements that they can use for their own benefit, but also they can use the connection with African countries in order to bypass the American Western sanctions imposed on them. And politically, they think that if they can enhance this kind of cooperation, actually, in the end of the day, it will be very hard for the West to continue the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. So all in all, when you're taking that into account and adding the aspect of Israel, and we'll talk a little bit about, of course, about the Iranian activity in Sudan, adding those elements, we understand why Africa is so important for Iran.
But this is not new. Iran has invested in Africa for years. What has changed recently?
I think, what I wrote in the article, and I think that it is important to mention that it's true that Africa was important to Iran in the past, and President Ahmadinejad really intensify the Iranian activity and foothold in this important continent. But in Rouhani's era, we saw that Rouhani and Zarif, his prime minister, are really relying on the West, trying to enhance the cooperation with the West and really neglecting Africa and also Latin America, and in general, what we call the global South. When Ibrahim Raisi, the late Ibrahim Raisi, elected to be president of Iran, he understood that in his own view, the future of Iran lies in enhancing this cooperation with the global South, China, India, but also Africa and Latin America. And in order to do so, he actually traveled to those continents and actually instructed the Iranian system to enhance the political and diplomatic cooperation with these countries. So that is an important element as its own. But for that, added another important aspect, and what we call the Iranian conventional proliferation, meaning that the Iranians now have the capabilities, mainly UAVs, that actually they can sell to countries that nobody else is selling those capabilities, mainly in Africa and other continents, and they can use that in order not only to get economical benefits, but also to increase their political influence on those countries. Sudan is an important example for
let's talk
that.
about Sudan, because we saw also in the article you referred to this, the transfer of Iranian military equipment and what and the relations to what it indicates to relating its intentions in the future. Why Sudan and why there?
So again, it's connected to how Iran see Africa. As we mentioned, there are some multiple benefits that they can take from Africa, and one important element is the help for what we call the Iranian access and increasing the threat on Israel by improving the circle of fire. Now, Sudan in that case is an important country because it's allowing Iran to transfer arms to Hamas via Sudan and the Sinai Peninsula. In the past, Iran used the regime in Sudan, influence it, and actually building the capabilities, the operational one, in order to transfer the sophisticated weapons to Hamas. Now, after Sudan decided to move to the Saudi camp, the Iranian really suffered because it's not only that Sudan was supported by the Saudis, but Sudan also thought about normalization with Israel.
Yeah.
And for the Iranians, it was a severe blow for the African inspiration. And they understood it would be very hard to compensate, to find other countries that they can use in order to transfer these kind of capabilities to Hamas. Now, the civil war that started in Sudan gave the Iranians another opportunity, golden one, in terms of they thought that if they will send Muhajir 6 UAVs to the use of the Sudanese army, controlled by a guy named Burhan, they can pressure it in order to build a port in Sudan and thus regaining control on the Sudani regime. So we see actually Sudan, how they're using their capabilities, the UAV capabilities, in order to increase their political foothold in a very strategic location. And looking into the future, when discussing about the buildup of Hamas, for sure the Iranians will try to use that in order to send these sophisticated capabilities to Hamas to rebuild itself. So that's an example how Africa is so important to Iran, but actually how it can be used for operational means.
How do you think the elections of a new president in Iran will affect what's happening in Sudan and in Africa as a whole?
I think it's $1 million question in terms not only connected to Sudan and Africa, but in a whole, whether Pezeshkian is going to actually pursue Raisi's policy or not. Now, we had an interesting glimpse into his way of thinking. He had an interview in Tehran Times saying that he's going to pursue this kind of policy in terms of reaching to global South. Now, again, exactly, it remains to be seen whether he's going to implement that or not. But my sense is that it cannot be ignored in terms of Iran. Find it, it's like very tempting to increase this kind of cooperation because when you're looking at the broader picture, like I mentioned, you can sell your capabilities to those countries. You can earn a lot from diplomatically, but also economically. You're not jeopardizing yourself in also many ways. And it's part of the overall Iranian way of thinking of joining BRICS and joining those elements and organizations that actually countering the Western way of thinking. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to pursue that in a way that Raisi pursued that and flying, visiting Africa and Latin America. And for sure, Pezeshkian, first and foremost, will want to reach a nuclear agreement with the West that will help him to lift the Western sanction, especially on the energy sector of Iran. But I think that in general, we won't see dramatic change in terms of Iran's ability and wishes to increase this kind of capabilities. They already build the infrastructure. They have annual and biannual meetings with African countries, East and West African countries. So I think in that regard, they build a foundation and they will continue to pursue that. And that is why, regardless of the repression between Pezeshkian and Raisi, I think we have to pay close attention to that. That is one. Second, also for operational side, Quds Force couldn't care less whether the president is Raisi or Pezeshkian. And they will continue to do a couple of things. First, to support the Sudanese. That is one. And second, they will try to work in the area of Bab el-Mandab together with the Houthis in order to increase the threat on Israel from Africa itself. So in that regard, and of course, on top of that, they will continue to organize terror plots against Israel interest in Africa as they tried to do previously, because for them they think it's easier to do so in terms of operational constraints. So I think in that regard, that won't change, unfortunately.
Yeah, clear. That is, the intentions are clear. And the question is, what can Israel now do? Given the information that you elaborated on, what can Israel do in order to prevent this?
Well, it's
another front.
Yes. Well, it's obviously it's easy to ignore, right? Because Israel has so many things on its plate, especially after the 7th of October, that it's very easy to ignore and saying, okay, Africa, we'll deal with that later. But by doing so, the problem won't be solved. It's only going to intensify. Now, it's obvious that when you're looking at the Israel diplomatic activity in Africa, you have 54 African countries, and you have only 10 countries that Israel actually has a diplomatic presence in them. Mm-hmm. So it's obvious that we cannot do that on ourselves. Mm-hmm. We need to work with coalitions. The American side is highly invested these days in Africa. There are multiple visits of seniors from Biden administration in that regard. So I think we need to cooperate with that, coordinate our activities to counter the Iranian influence, because in Africa, it's not only Iranian influence, but also Chinese and Russian influence. And we know that Iran is part of what we call the great power competition. So there is a sense of urgency in terms of working with the American in that regard. But also there are other countries, like we already mentioned, our Gulf partners that are highly interested in countering the Iranian activity in Africa. So we have to work with them as well. To invest more in Africa. We need to open more embassies. We need to be in those locations, because if you're not there physically, it's very hard to influence these kind of activities. So we need to do that as well. But I think in general terms, I think we have to look at the broader picture in terms of countering the Iranian activity. Once we'll do that, we'll have to invest in that as well. I think it's not only, we talk about Africa as a huge continent. I think Israel needs to focus mainly on the area of Bab el-Mandab Straits, and the need to make sure that Iran and the Houthis won't pose a danger to the Israeli civilian and military maritime activity over there. Where in Northern Africa, we need to make sure that Morocco, our strategic partner, won't be suffering from the Iranian activity against it, working together with the Algerians, with Algeria in that regard. So we have to help the Moroccans to counter this kind of activity. And also, of course, working with other countries in Africa that actually are ready to cooperate with Israel in that regard, whether it's the Sahel, in the Sahel region, other regions, in order to counter the Iranian malign activity. When I'm talking about malign activity, it's the selling arms, the diplomatic activity, but also what we call the soft power activity, meaning what Iran is trying to do using religious centers and academia facilities in order to influence the local population in those countries. So I think all in all, this should be a part of the overall strategy of Israel in order to counter the Iranian activity in Africa.
Clear. Denis Tsintrinovich, thank you so much for enlightening us on this very important issue. I hope that the relevant people also in the government are listening and will take action regarding Africa. This region definitely must not be ignored, with everything that has to do with Iran. Thank you so much, Denis Tsintrinovich, and thank you so much for our audience for tuning in, and see you in the next program. Goodbye.